Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. We still have some attendees joining us, but it is 12:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all to our second in the summer series of our PWCP speaker sessions. Today's topic is cover crops and your farm. My name is Linda Nickel. I am the Executive Director of Manitoba Association of Watersheds. Manitoba Association of Watersheds is the lead delivery for the Prairie Watersheds Climate Program. For anyone who is unfamiliar, the Prairie Watersheds Climate Program is funded through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's On-Farm Climate Action Fund and provides funding incentives to producers who implement any of the 3 beneficial management practices into their operations. To qualify, the eligible BMPs must be a new practice or an expansion of an existing practice onto new acres. The 3 BMPs eligible for PWCP funding are cover cropping, nitrogen management, and rotational grazing. There are various practices eligible for funding in each BMP category. To assist producers with the adoption of new BMPs, the program offers producers resources to support implementation and provide BMP design recommendations. Producers may be eligible for up to $75,000 to cover up to 85% of implementation costs on a cost share model. Funding limits may vary in each watershed district, so we do really encourage those who are interested in the program to reach out to their local delivery agents. In Manitoba, that is your local watershed district, and in Saskatchewan, that is the Saskatchewan Association of Watersheds, and everyone there is available to help with more information. Today's session qualifies for continuing education units for certified crop advisors. So I'm hoping you see a QR code on your screen. I was having a bit of a slide delay earlier, but there is a QR code available on screen for you to receive your CEUs. If you need to use a sign-in sheet instead of the QR code, please email me directly after the session today and we'll get you set up with that. I will also share this QR code at the end of this session as well. So if you miss it at this time and want to claim your CEUs later on, it will be on screen again for you. I'd also like to use this as a moment to thank our program partner on knowledge transfer and extension, the Manitoba Forage and Grasslands Association. Their executive director, Duncan Morrison, has been integral to setting up these speaker series and supported making sure that we have educational opportunities like this. So thank you to MFG and to Duncan for that. A few reminders that we have before we get started fully is that this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted to the Manitoba Association of Watersheds YouTube page following the session. We will also have slides available that Callum has very kindly offered to share with us. So that will be sent out as well to registered attendees so you can review all the data in more detail. Following the speaker session, there will be an opportunity for question and answer. So we do have the Q&A function activated within Zoom. And we'd encourage you to please jot your questions in there as we go, and we'll be able to answer them following Callum's presentation. If there are any unanswered questions, if we run out of time or anything like that, we will follow up to ensure that all questions are satisfied after the session as well. So today, as I mentioned, we will be focusing our session on cover cropping. Please note that Prairie Watersheds Climate funds a variety of activities under this BMP, including fall and spring cover crops, full season, annual and or perennial cover crops, planning and technical assessments. I will share in the link to our website in the chat box afterwards, which will contain detailed information on all eligible activities for you to review. And with that, I will officially welcome our guest speaker, Callum Morrison. He'll be speaking on the topic of cover crops and your farm. Callum Morrison is a crop production extension specialist working out of the Carman Agricultural Office with Manitoba Agriculture. Prior to that employment, Callum worked under Dr. Yvonne Lawley at the University of Manitoba, researching how farmers on Canadian prairies and Ontario have been using cover crops. His research has involved more than 1,300 farmers across 4 Canadian provinces and is one of the largest surveys of its kind in Canadian history. Please welcome Callum Morrison.
Hello, everyone.
Were you able to share your slides, Callum?
It's supposed to be sharing now. Can you see them?
Yes, they just came up. Thank you.
Awesome. So there'll probably still be a little delay on my end, but hopefully things will work well. Thank you very much for that introduction. So, now they're not moving on. Yeah, there's even a delay for me. So first of all, today, what I want to go over is really, first of all, define and have a little discussion on what exactly is a cover crop. Then I kind of want to go into the process that farmers go through when they decide whether a cover crop is right for them, and if so, how would a farmer decide which species and management strategies are right for them? So really, this involves the process a farmer should go through is, first of all, define their goals and identify opportunities, and then use those goals and opportunities you have to decide, let them influence what species you're going to grow, how you plan to establish them, and your termination. And then what's incredibly important is constantly evaluating the success of your cover crop, let that feed back into future years. We're also going to have a look at how farmers on the prairies are currently using cover crops, maybe help you benchmark and understand what's currently happening, and potentially give you a few ideas. So what exactly are cover crops? So a cover crop, they're plants that are planted to cover the soil rather than for the purpose of being harvested. And on the prairies, we have two major classes of cover crops, those which are shoulder season cover crops, which are planted between two cash crops. And then you've got full season cover crops, which are planted over the entirety of a cash crop growing season. Now, shoulder season cover crops can either be planted after harvest or before seeding of the new cash crop. Now, shoulder season cover crops, as I just mentioned, provide cover after cash crop harvest. They can either be planted after harvest or increase. What we're seeing in the prairies, a number of farmers are actually establishing their cover crops as an intercrop, and we think that may be one way that farmers are trying to get around some of the shorter growing seasons we have on the prairies and some of the problems with moisture deficits we see in the fall. So then they can potentially get a good cover crop in the fall. And cover crops, short season cover crops, they're either killed by freeze up in the winter, or they can survive the winter, such as fall rye, and then they have to be terminated in the spring by a variety of different methods, which we will be discussing later, quite often by herbicide, tillage, and such. So full season cover crops, these provide cover over the full season instead of growing a cash crop in that year. And they can be grown for a variety of different reasons. Quite often it's to improve problem soils, especially areas with high salinity, lowers down that water table. But also farmers on the prairies quite often use them when they have a cash crop failure, or maybe they weren't even able to get into that field that year to actually seed. So earlier this year, particularly last year, along the Red River, where we had a bit of flooding and the melt came quite late, a number of farmers weren't able to get on before the insurance deadlines. So these farmers, quite often they'd already bought their seed, they put on a cover crop, or what we were calling a gamble crop, i.e. they'd already bought their seed, they'll put it on, if they don't make it to harvest, it's a cover crop, it's still drying down that water table far faster and more efficiently than simply just leaving their soil bare woods with all that transpiration. And last year in particular, a number of these farmers were still able to actually get a successful crop off anyway. Then you've also got sort of green manures potentially to build nitrogen, but also many different ways you use full season cover crops, such as in between row fruit crops and such. But today, I'm really going to focus in on shoulder season cover crops, because as we'll come to understand, cover crop management is so specific to what you want to use it for and your farm that really it helps when you home in on specific types of cover crops when we're discussing them. So one thing I want people to kind of understand is there's many different ways that we can try and increase living plant cover. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to grow a cover crop. So for example, winter cereals will increase, will cover the soil at a time when the soil in a typical prairie system would be left bare. So fulfilling a lot of the goals of many cover croppers by reducing soil erosion. So just the idea that if your goal is to cover the soil, there's other things that you could potentially be doing, but also how cover crops, they kind of overlap with all of them. So depending on definitions and such, there's many things we can do. And one other thing which I think people should bear in mind is the role that volunteers and regrowth may be able to have as potentially being a cover crop in the fall, which we'll discuss a little bit later as well. So a little bit of context for where we are with cover cropping in Manitoba. So as I'm sure you're all aware, we have a number of environmental challenges on the prairies. Those are, we are limited by our short growing season, and especially our challenges with moisture. So our falls are typically dry, and typically our spring is very wet. So that can make establishment of cover crops difficult in the fall, and it potentially the wetness can make termination of cover crops difficult in the spring. But we still do have a growing number of early adopter farmers, which seems to be growing still. And they've seen the successes from North Dakota, from Ontario and the like, and they are trying cover crops out. And but there's really a need for knowledge networks to be set up at the moment. There's a number of cost share programs and such, like the program that was just discussed. And we are at the stage where we're really needing agronomists to be trained so that they can advise farmers on cover crop production. So really, when farmers are deciding on growing a cover crop, what they're doing is really defined by what goals they have for cover cropping and what opportunities they actually have on their farm. And these goals on the prairies, the two ones which I think are really quite achievable and where a lot of farmers I think would benefit are to protect against erosion and also managing excess moisture, particularly in these years where we can really suffer from excess moisture, particularly in the spring. But we've also got sort of build soil nitrogen, also scavenging nitrogen. For example, in this dry year, a lot of winter wheat and fall rye might not have utilized all of their nitrogen. So farmers may want to grow cover crops to try and keep that nitrogen on the field. It may not be utilized in the coming, it may not be mineralized over the next season, but at least it's staying on your field and will eventually be mineralized again. But also you've got suppressed weeds and grazing and such. But then you also have to think what windows and opportunities the farmers have for growing cover crops. And that's really defined by the cash crops grown on the farm. So what windows do they have? Where can they put the cover crop in? And also looking at what sort of weed control, what sort of tillage is being used on that farm. So how will that limit the cover crops you might be choosing? And also really limited by your location, so your individual climate and also your soils. So the first thing you have to consider when goals is why do you want to grow a cover crop? So by knowing why you want to grow it, that will help inform the decisions you're going to make with growing cover crops. So first of all, ask yourself, why do you want to grow that cover crop? And as I just said, your goals will help determine if cover crops are right for you and what management and species are best. Now, remember, having a goal does not mean that your goal will be achieved quickly. Some goals can be realized in a season, such as trying to lower down that water table, or, for example, try and fix that soil in place to prevent soil erosion, for example, after potatoes. You are going to provide an anchor to reduce erosion, but others, such as if you're aiming for a goal that is more long-term in nature, such as change soil structure and increase soil organic matter. Those are longer term goals that maybe take a much longer to be realized. And you should just know that some of your goals will be short term and long term. And yeah, so that's just some of that there. And this here, it's going to be put online later. And you can pause any of my graphs when they're online, and I'll also send out the slide deck so you can have time to go through this. But really, I asked 281 farmers who grow cover crop on the prairies a number of questions about their cover crop practices. And what I've done here is I've just looked at those who are growing fall cover crops and split them into not grazing and grazing. As you'll come to see, these two groups of farmers are quite different. So it really helps when we separate it out, and specific when we talk about cover crops. So you'll see most farmers who are growing cover crops are saying that they're really concerned about growing cover crops to help improve soil health and increase soil organic matter. But we see a variety of people growing cover crops for a variety of different reasons, such as erosion control, weed suppression, adding nitrogen, and such. So incredibly diverse there. What I find interesting is financial gains is just four from the bottom. So people seem to be mostly motivated on the prairies for environmental attributes of cover crops rather than financial gains when it comes to growing cover crops. So what opportunities do you have to grow a cover crop? Now, this is perhaps one of the most important, because if that opportunity doesn't work for you, you're perhaps not going to have the most successful cover crop. So one thing that's often on farmers' minds is it even possible to establish a cover crop? So what we found when we did the surveys, we got about a third of all of our respondents on the prairies from each province. We found people were growing cover crops right across the prairies, right down to the US border, and all the way up to the Peace River Valley in Alberta. And we expect really people would just be growing cover crops along a little strip across the border, but turns out we were seeing them all across, even as we went further west, where we tend to see more of these moisture problems in the fall. And if we just look at Manitoba here, on the left we have the full season cover crops where they were grown, and on the right we have the short season cover crops. So you can see that people are still establishing cover crops after cash crop harvest, and they are still they're doing it right the way across the province. So there are opportunities on a number of on people's farms to grow cover crops in the fall. So when we come to deciding, growing cover crops, you really need to also think about a number of things. So I think one of the most crucial is talking about those windows. So where do you have an opportunity? What cash crops are harvested the earliest, which give you the longest opportunity to establish a cover crop? That's one of the best places to start. So we're talking annual grains, peas, these sort of things. But also, where do you have that biggest need to actually protect the soil? So for example, after something like peas, dry beans, and potatoes, those soils quite often are very prone to blowing. Also consider, do you typically have enough moisture available in the fall to allow for cover crop establishment? But also, do you also desire the soil to remain bare or black in the soil to warm up in the spring? Do you have soils which are typically very wet in the spring? So therefore, a cover crop that overwinters may not be the best choice for you. You may favor something which winter kills, so then you don't have to worry about that those problems in the fall as much. You also have to consider what residual herbicides are used on your farm and how that might limit cover crop establishment and how you might have to change that. But also, crucially, farmers will be limited by what labor is present on the farm. Do they have labor to establish and manage cover crops at times when they may already be very, very busy? And also, farmers should really be confident in adding an extra layer of complexity on the farm. So this is just some things to consider when it comes to growing a cover crop on the prairies. So if we look at what people are growing shoulder season cover crops, what they are planting their cover crops after, we see We see barley, spring wheat, peas, and oats are the four most common cash crops grown before a cover crop. And really, what we're seeing is those are the ones which have the biggest opportunity in the fall for successful establishment. But what I also want you to take away is that people are growing cover crops after just about every cash crop we are growing on the prairies, whether that be canola, vegetables, potatoes, lentils, alfalfa, forages, flax, fall rye, etc., etc. But we see the most cover crops grown after those, which leave the biggest window for cover crop establishment. So when it comes to selecting a cover crop species, what we'll really be doing is looking into kind of what we have available, what we think is affordable, and what is going to help us reach those goals. So what we really also need to consider is each different species has different opportunities that we can bring to our farm, but it also comes with different risks and different costs. So we really should consider what plant characteristics will help me reach my goal. So for example, you might want to select something which is rapidly established or something which survives the winter. That might be something that's really important for you. But also, you may be someone who doesn't want to deal with trying to terminate that cover crop at a time when maybe your herbicide might not be successful. So you may decide you want to select something which will purposely winter kill. You also, I think farmers should really start off by thinking, what seed do I have that's already available? Do I want to consider bin run seed? That might be very affordable to you. And I also think farmers considering, say if they, after their combine, a lot of seed was left on the soil surface, maybe you want to nurture that as a cover crop. Dr. Yvonne Lawley at the University of Manitoba, she looked at strips of cover crops that they'd drilled in a number of locations across the province, as next to strips of if the volunteers and regrowth was just allowed to grow. They found in many cases the biomass of a drilled cover crop, as long as the volunteers were allowed to foster it in a way that allowed them to grow, the biomass was quite often similar to if a cover crop was drilled. It wasn't as uniform within the field as if you established a cover crop, but the biomass was pretty similar. So also consider that if you have a lot of things coming off the end of the combine, which of course you should still be doing calibration, try and get everything off, but you may have opportunities to protect that soil with any volunteers coming off the end of the combine. So also consider what your budget is. How much are you willing to spend? Again, that's affected by your goals. If one of your goals is grazing, you may be willing to spend more than if your major goal is just keep that soil in place. Also consider how does that species that you have complement your current crop rotation? Are you, for example, worried that you may be creating a green bridge? And also, do you want to be adding in something which will add diversity to your rotation? So you may want to select a species of something you're not already growing. But also, are you concerned that your cover crop may become a weed in the future? So things like Phacelia and vetches, they are notorious for becoming weeds if they're not terminated before going to seed. And as I said before, really consider how important to you is it for that cover crop to overwinter. And overwintering cover crops tend to have the highest amount of biomass, but then termination becomes a big thing for you. So just determine what sort of cover crops you think might work for you. And again, that came from your goals and what opportunities you have. So if we look at the most common cover crop species, we're seeing clover, fall rye, buckwheat, radish, peas, oats, and such. And as you can see, a lot of these cover crops, such as oats, peas, fall rye, and such, a lot of these are crops that people can get very cheaply, access, maybe even their own bin run seed and such. One thing to notice, you can see that non-grazers, grazers, they're using a bigger variety of cover crops in general. And there's only one two cover crops which are grown more commonly by non-grazers than grazers, and those are fall rye and spring wheat. Now, another thing is people constantly just ask questions of how many species should I have in my cover crop? And the answer is what's right for you. And generally, non-grazers who are growing cover crops in the fall, they're growing pretty simple cover crop mixes. So the majority of farmers who are not intending to graze their cover crops established to cover the soil in the fall, they're just growing one species, and then you can see it drastically drops off. Whereas farmers that are intending to graze their fall cover crops, we're seeing the most common response around 2 to 3 species, followed by 6 to 7 species. So really, that just shows again the goal, shows that people are willing to invest more in their cover crop and have a more diverse cover crop. Whereas the goal of someone who's trying to just cover the soil in the fall, that can be achieved by just one species and something potentially a lot cheaper. So again, when we look at the cost that these fall season cover croppers are paying, we see the most common response for those that aren't grazing their cover crops are really in the range of $5 to $15 per acre. And this is just the cost for seed, not factoring in costs of fuel and time such as established. Whereas those who are intending to graze, it's a lot higher, really between $21 and $35 an acre. So again, that shows how your goals have defined what you're willing to spend. So cover crop establishment. So when thinking about establishment, you really need to consider how your seeding timing and method will greatly affect the potential for each seed to successfully establish. And therefore, seeding methods will affect the seeding rate for cover crops. So, for example, broadcasting a cover crop, it may be easier for you to get on if it's really, really wet. But in a dry year, it's not going to be very successful establishment method. Whereas if you were to drill the cover crop, you can increase the likeliness of decent seed to soil contact and then getting successful cover crops. I had some cover crop plots at the crop diagnosis school this year, and our cover crops that were drilled this year, which is incredibly dry, did a lot better. They were a lot further along than those that we broadcast onto the soil surface. So, but also really, again, tailor it to your farm. What equipment do you already have available to you? Do you already have the ability to interseed? Because that might make it maybe allow you to establish your cover crop earlier, potentially get a bit more biomass, and really just get right out of your cash crop, right into a cover crop. But also, as I said before, have you considered the regrowth potential from cereals of volunteers for canola? And another thing you can do is try and foster those volunteers, or say if you broadcast, try and increase the ability to success would be to actually use some form of light tillage to incorporate a little bit of that seed. Maybe you do a harrowing pass type thing. And that could potentially increase your chances of decent establishment in the fall. So one thing we asked in our survey is kind of, was the cover crop established as an intercrop? We found that if we're talking about the non-grazers, we found most farmers are still establishing their cover crop as a monocrop after cash crop harvest. But if you look, a good proportion of farmers are actually starting their cover crop as an intercrop at some point within the growing season, either with cash crop planting or a little later. So there's many different opportunities farmers have. Quite often, I think it's still a good way to start simple and then add more complex things. But people are using intercropping, establishing their cover crop at some point during that growing season. And many of those farmers are finding it successful, but it comes with a number of extra challenges. I, at the University of Manitoba Research Farm in Carmen, several years tried to establish canola into soybeans. And the challenge was whenever we drilled our canola and they were coming up with those lovely cotyledon stage, we were always hit by hungry flea beetles. So we were never able, or I was never able to establish canola into soybean successfully. So it is being done, but as I say, a number of challenges that you have to tailor and understand how things are going to work on your particular farm. So then we have questions of termination. And really, you have to consider what method of termination, again, works best for you. So really, things like herbicides, tillage, mowing, grazing, but quite often it's more than one method. Now, a lot of farmers have to consider what the alternative will be, because quite often unexpected conditions may prevent your first termination test. So for example, for herbicide to work, in most cases, the cover crop needs to be actively grown. Now, if it's cold when you apply your herbicide, that tillage path, that termination pass may not work. And you may be getting quite stressed if you're needing to terminate that so you can plant your next cover crop. And again, if it's very, very wet, you may not actually be able to access the field to do such termination passes. But also consider if it's necessary for you to have that spring growth to achieve your goals. In many cases, it's essential if you're really wanting to prevent that erosion. That some other farmers that might not be as important. And just consider, do you want to add complexity of termination, essentially? And in those cases, maybe you might consider something like a pea or a barley or something, or spring wheat that would winter kill and allow you to forego those challenges of termination, but missing out on cover, living cover in the spring. So if we have a look at terminations of cover crops, for those that aren't grazing in the fall, which you can see in the red polka dots, really you're seeing tillage, winter kill, and herbicides are the three most common ways that the cover crops are dying. But you can see there's a number of different ways that people are terminating their cover crops. Of course, people who are grazing, they are grazing is a major way that they are terminating their cover crops, but of course, in many cases, those grazers are still having to use another method to also take care of that cover. So farmers need to constantly be evaluating their successes, what benefits they've seen, what challenges they've faced, and constantly using that to improve what they're doing on their farm. And I always like thinking farmers should start simple and potentially on a small part of their farm and work upwards if they want to in the future. So first of all, consider what may have worked well, what may have worked not so well, but also determine, did you meet your short-term goals? And think about, have you been contributing to your long-term goals? Then use this to feed into planning for next year's rotation. One thing which I really like the idea is using maybe one or two check strips to help you really evaluate any differences that you might be seeing in the field, successes and such. Also, I think it's important to consider that you don't need to cover crop on every acre. Where do you think you have the greatest impact? Again, where do you have the opportunity? And there's don't feel bad for just trying it on a small part of your farm. If you want in the future and you think it's working, then you can up your acres. And we did find in our survey that most farmers tend to either maintain or increase their cover crop acres over time. They also tend to increase their diversity a little bit over time or maintain. So I think that those are sort of some evidence that starting simple can be a good way to get started. And this is just showing what percentage of farmers' farms that responded to our survey were onto cover crops. This is just to highlight again that there is nothing wrong with just cover cropping on a small number of your total farms. So we're seeing those who are grazing are growing in the fall, are growing cover crops on really less than 20% of their acres. And you're seeing a similar sort of smaller percentage of farmers who are not grazing, growing cover crops. Really, less than a third of their acres. So farmers on the prairies aren't growing cover crops after every single crop. Again, it comes down to your opportunities and what your goals are. So after some crops, the need will be so much greater to grow a cover crop, like after potatoes. There may be other crops which have heavy residues that will help protect that soil in the fall. So again, when we talk about really evaluating cover crop success in that, you should really look at benefits and try and quantify what you're seeing. Now, we asked farmers on the prairies who were growing cover crops what benefits they've seen from growing cover crops. And most farmers told us that they'd seen benefits. The most common benefits were improved soil health, less weeds, less erosion, increased soil organic matter. A good number of farmers, about 30% of those who weren't grazing and about 12% of those who were grazing, said they hadn't yet seen benefit. Now, it is important to mention that the majority of those farmers who said that they had yet seen benefits only started cover cropping the year before the survey went out. So they hadn't been cover cropping as long. Another important thing to just mention, though, is if we look, only about 25% of farmers that weren't grazing, and just shy of 20%, said that they had seen financial gains. Now, that didn't mean that they'd believed that they'd had a reduction in profitability on their farm. We had a separate question where we asked farmers, how do you think cover crops have influenced your profitability? Far more farmers said that they thought it increased their profitability than reduced. But the key message is it's really too early to say. 47% of farmers that we asked the profitability question, 47% said they had no idea how cover crops had influenced their profitability. So really, it's still too early to say what prairie farmers are telling us with profitability, because they're still at such an early stage. And a lot of the benefits farmers are going after take a while to achieve and are quite often difficult to measure. Some things that, as I said before, you can notice quite easily if you are having an impact on erosion. It's a lot more difficult to know some of these other attributes people are going after. But still, more people seeing financial gains than told us that they were having issues with profitability because of cover crop. So now, really important, we need to look at challenges that farmers face, and you need to keep a track of these. You know, if you are having problems with green bridges, like for example, we had problems with cover crops at some plots where we were having problems with barley yellow dwarfing virus because we were creating that green bridge. And again, you know, maybe you're having problems with flea beetles and such. So use that information to adapt how you would cover crop in subsequent years. So on the prairies, for those who aren't raising their cover crops, really late harvest prevented cash crop planting. So again, that is influenced by the climate and also what you grew. So again, that just shows again how what you're growing affects your cover crop. And again, that shows the adaptability. You might have intended to grow a cover crop, but just the way fate turned out, you weren't able to. And I think farmers need to be comfortable with, you may have the intention to grow a cover crop, but it might not work in every year, in every situation. And that's okay. Another major challenge is not enough moisture in the fall for establishment. Now, that is often a challenge. But if you remember a few years ago, I think it was 2019, there was a huge amount of moisture in the fall. And then it may become one of your goals to really try and dry out that soil so you don't have problems in the spring with planting. So that's just an example of how your potential benefits and goals and challenges change year on year. And I think we need to be flexible to account for that. Cover crops are a tool to help you reach a goal, and we need to be comfortable that we may not be able to use them all the time, but they have a number of different potential things that they can do for you. Shortness of the growing season, another big challenge. Cover crop failure, quite often because, as I said before, there's maybe not enough moisture when you establish it, they didn't do too well. But what's interesting, about 22% of farmers who were grazing said they'd never seen a problem. But I'm sure the longer that they grow, eventually they will run into some challenge. It is important to note that any crop you grow, you will also have challenges with, whether that be grasshoppers, bee beetles, such. So cover crops aren't unique to challenges. But also some other problems farmers have is accessing information from agronomists and people on growing cover crops, additional costs, increased labor. But we will send out the slide deck so you can have a look at some of the things that you should consider. It's a good idea going into cover crops, understanding what some of the challenges you may face, so you can start to anticipate them and think about ways around them, how you will try and avoid some of these challenges. So we also asked some farmers who didn't grow cover crops, hadn't grown cover crops before. So for this one, we asked farmers who wanted to try growing cover crops and those who didn't want to try growing cover crops. And in green, we have those who wanted to try. And in the polka dot red, we asked people the same question to those who didn't want to try. And unsurprisingly, we found that the shortest growing season was the biggest thing holding back people growing cover crops. But what was very interesting is for the huge difference between those who wanted to try and didn't want to try is we had the second most and third most common reasons were with the farmer who wanted to try, didn't know where to get started. They didn't feel they had the lack of information. So basically, a good portion of farmers who want to try are sitting there wanting to try, but they're looking for more information and more guidance on what to do. So that is something which I see as more people get cover cropping and agronomists get more comfortable and such, I can see us making that a bit easier for some farmers. But this is just something interesting to kind of have a look at there, all the different things which are preventing farmers from growing cover crops of these two groups. So it might be interesting for you to have a look through that. So some key messages just to take away, which this has been mostly a little just discussion, just to let you go through and just have a few things to think about the complexities of cover crops and what things to consider before you start. So first of all, I want you to do, if you're considering growing a cover crop, define your goals. So why do you want to grow a cover crop? And also it can help to rank them. What is your most important goal? And put that back. So maybe erosion is your number one. Maybe you maybe that drying down that soil is also number one, and this can change year on year. It can also help you to separate out your short-term goals and your long-term goals. I also then want you to, once you've had a thought of your goals, sit down and kind of think, what is my opportunity to establish cover crops? So do I have a great opportunity after peas that are harvested quite early to grow cover crops, for example? Have a look at what opportunities exist and how your current cropping system, such as your tillage regime, your herbicide regime and such, how that, what opportunities and limits are already existing on your farm, and even including things like what labor is available and such, and what costs you're willing to put into. So all of those things, how that feeds into your opportunities you have. And once you've had a look, only then, once you've looked at your goals and your opportunities, do you want to use that to guide when you decide what you're going to grow and how you're going to manage it in the farm. Now, I really want you to remember, cover crops are a useful tool to help you achieve specific goals. They're not a mantra. They're not something that you will be able to grow in every single situation and every single year. But I also want you to know the cover crops are being grown in a variety of different ways right the way across the prairies, in a variety of climates, a variety of soils, and after just about every cash crop there are. So there are ways you can do it, but know that not every farmer has the same opportunities, and that can also change by year. Also, yeah, I've kind of just said that, but cereals and peas provide some of the largest windows but also we're seeing it after like even vegetables and potatoes and such. Most fall season cover crops are simple. And I like the idea of starting simple and perhaps just choosing to do it on a small section of your farm. And over time, you can increase and do better. The most important thing is setting yourself up for success. Don't get overwhelmed. Plan for what, if you plan well and you know what you're getting into and you do something simple, there's nothing wrong with being more complex and planning things into the future. And also consider what is already available to you, what's cheap, what's accessible, and also consider if you have the potential to foster those volunteers and regrowth. Because in many cases, if you're just looking to keep that soil in place in the fall, you can achieve that with some of your regrowth and your volunteers. So if you'd like some more information on prairie cover crops, you can have a look at the results from our prairie cover crop survey, as well as our Ontario cover crop feedback. And on the right here, you can see Virginia Jansen, who was at the University of Manitoba and now works for the Watershed Districts. She produced this fantastic Cover Crops 101, which kind of goes over some of the things I've discussed today, and just allows you to kind of go through that process of identifying your goals, identifying what opportunities you have, and then helping you kind of think about what seed rates and things you might want to be looking at. So it's a great resource to have a look at. And I think one of the first things you should do if you are considering growing cover crops on the prairies. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take some questions. And if it's not something I think I can answer right away, make sure that you send me an email and I'll do my best. But it's also something I want to learn from you guys. Most of what I've learned from cover crops, I've learned from the farmers and agronomists, and I want to continue doing that. And I'd love to come out and see some of your cover crop successes and challenges in the future.
Thank you so much, Callum. That was a fantastic presentation. Greatly appreciate your insight and your expertise. As we noted, you've spoken to so many farmers, so many agronomists. I know that's greatly informed your practice and research. And we've really benefited from that knowledge share today. So thank you for that. As mentioned at the top, we will be making the slides and video recording of this session available afterwards. I've also included in the chat box some links both to our website as well as, to Callum's point, if there are success questions, you can please send us an email. I've included both the MAW project team as well as Callum's direct email. And we really love to hear from you because, to echo Callum's point, we learn so much when we have the opportunity to speak with and visit farmers or agronomists because you're really the experts in what it is you're doing and what will work best on your land. I've got the QR code back up on screen for any certified crop advisors. Please make sure to capture that code and sign in to get your continuing education units. Thank you to our program delivery agents, the Manitoba Watershed Districts and the Saskatchewan Association of Watersheds. For anyone who is interested in learning more about the Prairie Watersheds Climate Program or applying directly or supporting farmers to apply directly, the first step to take is to reach out to those local representatives in Manitoba and Saskatchewan to learn directly from them and to be supported in your application process. Thanks again to Manitoba Forage and Grasslands Association for their support in planning these speaker sessions. Stay tuned because we will have our third and final summer series coming up in the beginning of September, and we will be announcing details about that very soon. So keep an eye on your inbox and our social media. I see we don't have any open questions, which I think is always nice. It gives us a chance to get back to our days. But just thank you again, Callum, for joining me today and sharing your insight into cover cropping with all of us. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Excellent. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.